It is seen as the spark that lit the spluttering fuse which began the English Civil War. It is also quite rightly seen as one of the most important events in British history in the 17th century. But all too often it is glossed over by phrases such as, Charles I raised his standard at Nottingham, and so began the English Civil War. But what actually happened? Who was there? What was the atmosphere like? Was the raising of the standard greeted by cheering crowds and thousands of willing recruits? Charles I had moved to York after months of argument and counter-argument with Parliament, and it was here that he received the 19 propositions. These basically desired the king to allow Parliament to decide the future of the church, to be in charge of the army, and to select the king's own ministers. It is unsurprising that the king refused these with the words, framed by raisers of sedition and enemies of sovereign power. He soon moved himself and his court to Nottingham. But why Nottingham? Why not Oxford? That was to become his capital for large parts of the future conflict. Maybe it was because Nottingham had access along the River Trent to the Humber estuary, from where he could receive support from the Netherlands. On the 12th of August, 1642, the king sent out a proclamation to all subjects residing on the north side of the Trent, or within 20 miles southward thereof, to assemble at Nottingham on the 22nd of August, where we intend to erect our standard royal in our just and necessary defence, and where we resolve to advance forward for the oppression of our said rebellion, and this protection of our good subjects among them, from the burden of our slavery and insolence under which they cannot but groan, and they relieved by us. It is to be noted early on in this tale that men did not readily flock to the king, and like the weather that hovered overhead, the whole affair was dismal and full of gloom. When the king and his entourage arrived, one Colonel Hutchinson was appointed governor of the castle. Hutchinson was a local landowner, and was himself to be one of the signatories of the king's death warrant 7 years later. His wife Lucy gives a brief description of the castle at this time. Very ruinous and uninhabitable. However, though his army was tiny at the moment, it needed a commander. This embryo of an army was led by Sir John Digby, who had a desire to bring the whole of Nottinghamshire under royal control. He managed to secure Newark early on, but this was countered by the fact the royalists could not take control of the whole of Nottingham itself. Another royalist at this time was angered by the refusal of the locals to join the king's cause. Sir William Penniman thought that the townspeople below the castle should have their houses burnt to the ground, as they had not come forward to help their sovereign. In Nottingham today, where the General Hospital stands on Standard Hill, there is a tablet with the inscription, "On a mound about 60 yards to the rear of this tablet, Charles I raised his standard, August 25th, 1642. According to Bishop Trollope, Richard Lang painted the standard, which was then attached to a red pole. Next to the standard was a St. George's cross, and on the red cross was written the unusual legend, "Give unto Caesar his due." There is also a description which states the standard also had the phrase, Religio Protestantium leges Angliae libertis parliamenti, or for the religion of the Protestants, the laws of England, and the liberty of Parliament. The standard was pennon-shaped, or triangular, tapering and cloven, and had a great length. So great a length, apparently, that this red large streamer required 20 supporters to bear it. When the standard was raised, Sir Edmund Verney, Knight Marshal, was recorded to hold the standard and cry out, "They who would take that standard from him must first wrest his soul from his body." Apparently this exhortation was followed by the cheering of soldiers and sounding of trumpets. Sir Edmund Verney was the king's standard bearer at Edge Hill, the first major pitched battle of the English Civil Wars. It was here that, holding the king's standard, he was eventually cut down and the standard captured by parliamentarian soldiers. Later in the day, the standard was recaptured for the king, and as legend has it, Verney's hand was still clasped about it. Still, at Nottingham, Samuel Lawson, a maltster, was sworn and examined. He reported, "Saw the King's standard brought forth at Nottingham Castle, borne upon divers gentlemen's shoulders, who were noblemen, and he saw the same carried by them on the hill, close adjoining the castle, with a herald before it. And there the said standard was erected with great shouting, acclamation, and the sound of drums and trumpets. And when the same standard was erected, there was a proclamation made, and that he, this deponent, saw the King present at the erecting thereof." However, there are conflicting reports stating that the people looked on sullenly as dark storm clouds created a gloomy atmosphere. Indeed, the night following the raising of the standard, a great gale blew across Nottingham and blew the King's standard down. A grim foreshadowing, if ever there was one. A few days later, on the 25th, the standard was moved to a more open field to the north side of the castle wall. The King believing putting the standard in a more exposed position would allow more people to see it, and thus more people join the cause. But unfortunately for the King, the moving of the standard and his constant calls for support yielded little. Things grew worse as he received a message from Parliament stating, "Until the King's proclamation were withdrawn and the King's standard taken down, they could not, consistently with the public trust reposed in them and the general good of the nation, agree to the terms prepared by His Majesty." A few days after receiving this, and still entrenched in the castle, the King replied, "From our court at Nottingham, to all commissioners, sheriffs, mayors, justices of the peace, throughout England and Wales, directing them to apprehend the Earl of Essex, leading parliamentary forces, and to disarm all popish recusants, ill-affected persons, Brownists, Anabaptists, and other sectaries who had certified their ill disposition to the peace and government of the kingdom." These official messages between Crown and Parliament achieved little, and the 31st of August saw the King writing for more support. "To our trusty and well-beloved Sir Gervase Clifton, Knight, asking for all arms you shall think fit to send us." In response to this, there was within 3 days sent a number of saddles, bridles, pistols, muskets, and pikes. Unfortunately for Sir Gervase, his efforts were to backfire on him later on. After the war, he was forced to pay the sum of £4,000 to Parliament, as a fine for his delinquency to Parliament. In modern terms, £4,000 is approximately £470,000 in modern currency. The King's move to Nottingham, his inability to hold the town, and the failure to raise substantial forces all led the King to leave Nottingham for Salisbury on the 13th of September 1642. As we can see, there is a remarkable difference between the romantic paintings and sketches done to celebrate the raising of the King's standard against the actual reality. Against this backdrop of brooding, doom-laden clouds was Charles's desperate plea for men, arms and funds. His raising of his standard is still rightfully seen as a watershed moment in English history, but it was certainly not a triumphant start to Charles's war.